The wind howled across the Montana plains like a living thing, whipping snow into jagged, ghostly shapes that danced across the barren landscape. Even in late October, the air carried the sharp bite of winter's promise. Most folks had already shuttered their cabins and bunked down for the season, lighting wood stoves and hunkering close to family. But not Caleb Turner. Caleb had never been much for following rules or traditions. His neighbors, mostly grizzled prospectors and old-timers who'd spent decades chasing gold and silver, looked at him as if he were some kind of curiosity. They had log cabins, solid, square, and stubborn against the Montana cold, and then there was Caleb's tent. It wasn't a tent like the ones he'd grown up seeing at fairs or hunting trips. This was something else. He called it the Haven, though nobody else dared. It was built from heavy canvas treated with a secret coating Caleb wouldn't disclose, framed with steel poles he'd scavenged from abandoned mines and old barns. From the outside, it looked laughable, a lopsided canvas haphazardly patched with duct tape and tar. But inside, it was warm, dry, and strangely inviting. The first-time old man Harris, a prospector with frost-white hair and hands like splintered wood, saw it. He laughed until tears ran down his cheeks. "You call that a place to ride out the winter? Ha, my log cabin laughs at your circus tent," Harris shouted across the frozen creek that separated their claims. Caleb only smiled. He'd heard it all before. "You'll see," he said, voice calm, almost teasing as he adjusted a taut rope. "Come January, you'll be wishing you de-built one like this." Harris snorted. "I've been through 40 winters. I know what cold feels like. You're just a kid playing pioneer." Caleb was 33, but the rugged winter sun had tanned his face and lined it in ways that made him look older. Years of prospecting alone had carved patience and stubbornness into him like rings in a tree trunk, and he liked it that way. He liked the solitude, the rhythm of the land, the challenge of surviving where others only complained. By late November, the other prospectors had retreated to their cabins, fires crackling and dogs curled at their feet, while Caleb's tent stood alone against the prairie. Nights dropped to near-zero temperatures, ice forming on the edges of the tent and frosting the small, reinforced windows. But inside, it was a different world. Caleb had rigged a small, efficient wood-burning stove and insulated the tent floor with layers of reclaimed wool blankets, cardboard, and pine boughs. He'd studied airflow, heat circulation, and insulation like a mad scientist obsessed with a single experiment. On the first cold night, he'd lit the stove and stepped inside, closing the heavy canvas flap behind him. The warmth hit him like a soft hand on the back of his neck, 45 degrees warmer than the air outside. He leaned back against a stack of firewood and let out a slow breath. This was the kind of peace the other prospectors didn't understand, being alone, yet completely alive. He could hear the snowstorm raging outside, yet here he was in a dry, warm bubble untouched. Word of Caleb's tent spread quickly, like a wildfire in a parched forest. First it was whispers. "Have you seen Turner's tent? Doesn't even have walls and he's still warm." Then came the sneers and bets. Some of the prospectors rode over curious, their horses' hooves crunching in the frost. They arrived expecting a joke. What they found was a tent that radiated comfort, a place where the cold couldn't reach. Harris was the first to step inside, and his expression froze as if someone had shoved him into a furnace. His nose twitched. His fingers flexed involuntarily as he realized the truth. How is this possible?" he stammered. Caleb just chuckled. "Magic, hard work, a little bit of both." The prospectors didn't know whether to laugh, nod, or swear. They'd spent decades carving cabins out of pine logs, hauling rocks, and patching roofs with tar, only to see a flimsy-looking tent outperform everything they'd built. And it wasn't just warmth. The tent was dry, too. Rain and melting snow dripped off the canvas without ever seeping in. It seemed impervious to the elements. But Caleb had a secret beyond the structure itself. He had spent the summer experimenting with different materials, studying old construction manuals, and even testing prototypes in his small workshop back home in Butte. He'd learned from every failure, the soggy canvas, the collapsing frame, the drafty edges, and applied the lessons meticulously. It was obsession, yes, but also genius in disguise. That night, as the wind howled and snow battered the tent, Caleb felt something shift inside him. He realized that survival wasn't just about fighting the elements. It was about mastering them, bending them without breaking. And in that moment, with the storm raging outside and the ire crackling beneath his hands, he felt an unspoken kinship with the land itself. The next morning, the other prospectors couldn't resist visiting again. They brought coffee, tools, and their best skepticism, each eager to test the limits of Caleb's creation. "Try sleeping in it," one muttered, arms crossed, a sneer hidden beneath his frostbitten mustache. Caleb only grinned. "Do it, just don't forget to bring your fireproof dreams." One by one, they crawled in, each emerging hours later with wide eyes and sheepish smiles. The tent had survived sub-zero nights that left their cabins creaking, frozen, and drafty. And the warmth, it wasn't just comfort. It was a revelation. Even Harris, the man who'd laughed hardest, nodded silently. "Kid, you might just be onto something," he admitted, voice low. There was a hint of awe in it, grudging but real. Word spread beyond the immediate valley. By December, travelers, journalists, and curious locals were making the trek to see Caleb's tent. Some brought cameras, others brought questions, but all left with the same realization. This wasn't just a novelty. It was innovation, survival made tangible. Yet amidst the growing attention, Caleb remained quiet, almost withdrawn. He wasn't building this for fame or money. He was building it for freedom, for control over a world that seemed determined to test every nerve and muscle. But the whispers, the attention, began to stir unease. Some prospectors eyed him with envy, others with suspicion. After all, the idea that a tent could outperform a log cabin was as threatening as it was fascinating. One evening, Caleb stepped outside into a fresh snowfall, the sky painted with streaks of pink and purple. He watched his tent stand alone in the open field, canvas flapping gently in the wind, smoke curling from the stove's chimney. It looked fragile, yet it was more durable than anything around it. He felt a mix of pride and unease, pride for what he had accomplished, unease for the attention it was now drawing. And then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow, deliberate and heavy. Someone was coming, and Caleb knew that with winter in full force, curiosity could turn to conflict and admiration could turn to rivalry. He straightened, letting the calm confidence of months of preparation wash over him. Whatever was coming, he would meet it. After all, he had built more than a tent. He had built proof that ingenuity, determination, and a refusal to follow tradition could create something extraordinary, something capable of defying the harshest winter Montana could throw at him. He took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs, and waited, every muscle alert. The storm was coming, not from the sky, but from the world of men who would see his creation either as a miracle or a threat. And Caleb Turner was ready for either. The footsteps in the snow grew louder, crunching rhythmically against the frozen earth. Caleb didn't flinch. He'd spent years listening to the wilderness, reading the whispers of the wind and the subtle signs of animals, so he knew exactly who it was before the figure came into view. It was Harris, Old Man Harris, staggering slightly under the weight of a sled loaded with firewood. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his beard was frosted white, but there was a spark in his eye that hadn't been there before. He stopped a few feet from the tent, set down the sled, and exhaled so forcefully that his breath rose like smoke. I had to see it again," he admitted, rubbing his hands together, trying to shake off the chill. Can't believe it. 45 degrees warmer, you said." Caleb nodded, stepping aside to let Harris in. 45, and dry too, not a drop of moisture in here since the first snow. Harris peeked inside and muttered something under his breath, like a prayer or a curse. "I've been doing this wrong my whole life," he said finally, his voice tinged with awe and something else. Humility, the kind that comes only after decades of confidence has been challenged. Caleb didn't respond. He simply smiled and stoked the fire, letting the warmth roll across the floor and up the canvas walls. For the next few weeks, Caleb's tent became more than a novelty, it became a haven. Prospectors started visiting regularly, not just to marvel at its design, but to ask questions, to learn. Some were polite, some less so. Old rivalries and jealousies simmered beneath polite conversation, and Caleb learned to navigate both. He answered the curious honestly, deflected the envious with humor, and ignored the aggressive. Then came the storm. Not the typical Montana flurries or bitter wind. This was the kind of blizzard that made grown men curse God, nature, and themselves all at once. Snow piled higher than the fences, and the wind shredded trees like paper. Caleb's neighbors hunkered down in their log cabins, some losing roof tiles, others shivering despite thick wool blanket. And roaring fires. Caleb, however, was calm. He had prepared for this moment. The tent's frame groaned under the wind, but it held. The canvas shivered but didn't tear. Inside, the stove burned steadily, the warmth radiating through the tent like a living thing. 45 degrees warmer than the frozen wasteland outside. And for the first time, Caleb understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about proving, beyond doubt, that ingenuity mattered more than tradition, that thinking differently could conquer the impossible. But storms had a way of revealing more than just physical strength. They revealed character. The first knock came in the middle of the night, soft but deliberate. Caleb unlatched the flap and found Harris, snow-drenched and shivering. "My cabin, it's gone," Harris stammered, voice barely audible over the wind. "Roof collapsed, everything lost." Caleb's brow furrowed. "Come in," he said, ushering him inside. "Sit by the fire, you'll be warm in a minute." Harris stumbled forward, collapsing on a pile of blankets. His eyes scanned the interior with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. I don't know what to say," he whispered, his hands trembling. You saved me." Caleb shrugged, keeping his voice calm despite the storm outside. "It's just a tent, Harris, but it works. That's all that matters." The two men sat in silence for a long time, listening to the blizzard hammer the tent's exterior. For Harris, it was a revelation. For Caleb, it was confirmation that his stubbornness, his obsession with perfecting something unconventional, had real-world consequences, not just for himself, but for others. By morning, the storm had eased slightly, leaving a landscape transformed into an icy white wasteland. Trees were bent, fences broken, and most cabins had sustained damage. News of Caleb's tent and Harris's survival spread quickly. Soon, more prospectors began arriving, some skeptical, others desperate. The tent, once a symbol of youthful eccentricity, was now a beacon of hope. But with hope came tension. One man, Doyle Matthews, a grizzled prospector known for his temper and ambition, glared at Caleb one afternoon. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he said, pacing in front of the tent. "A flimsy piece of cloth keeps you warm while my cabin collapses. You're mocking us." Caleb looked up from repairing a small tear in the canvas. "I'm not mocking anyone, Doyle. I just built something that works, that's all." Doyle's eyes narrowed. "That's not all. You're showing us up, making us look like fools, and I don't take kindly to fools thinking they're clever." The air thickened, tension like static. Caleb stood slowly, meeting Doyle's glare without flinching. "If you want to prove something, build something better. Otherwise, just stay out of the way." Doyle's hand twitched toward his belt, but he thought better of it. Caleb had that look, calm, unyielding, like the mountains themselves. Doyle turned away, muttering under his breath, but the seed of rivalry had been planted. The winter dragged on, brutal and relentless. Caleb spent his days repairing the tent, experimenting with new insulation methods and mapping out the surrounding terrain. Nights were spent beside the fire, reading old mining journals, writing notes, and listening to the wind sing against the canvas. Each storm, each sub-zero night strengthened his confidence and tested it. He had to innovate constantly, finding solutions for condensation, heat retention, and snow load. But he thrived on the challenge. Yet for all his success, isolation gnawed at him. Most nights, he imagined a world outside his tent, a world of connection, of people who understood what it meant to create something extraordinary. He thought of Harris, Doyle, and the other prospectors, wondering if they would ever truly grasp the dedication behind the haven. Or if, once winter passed, they would shrug it off as a quirk, a lucky fluke. One evening, a knock came that changed everything. A young woman, no older than 28, stood at the tent's entrance, snow clinging to her boots and coat. Her name was Leela Granger, a journalist from Helena sent to cover the winter's blizzards. "Mr. Turner," she asked, voice steady despite the cold, "I heard about your tent. I need to see it for myself." Caleb eyed her warily. "Most people don't make it through the snow to get here," he said, stepping aside. Leela stepped inside, brushing snow from her hair. Her eyes widened immediately, taking in the warm, cozy interior, the carefully stacked firewood, the meticulous insulation. This is incredible," she whispered. "How did you do it?" Caleb shrugged, though a small smile tugged at his lips. Time, trial and error, stubbornness, nothing more magical than that. She raised an eyebrow, unconvinced by his modesty. "There's magic here, Caleb, not the kind you can explain with formulas, something more. People will want to know, they'll want to see this, learn from it, replicate it. You're onto something bigger than a tent, bigger than survival." Her words lingered long after she left, a mix of excitement and unease stirring within Caleb. She was right. This was no longer just about enduring winter. It was about influence, responsibility, and the possibility of changing how people thought about shelter, resilience, and ingenuity. And yet with influence came danger. The winter was only halfway through, and Caleb could feel it. The envy, the rivalry, the potential for sabotage. He tightened the tent flaps and stoked the fire, letting the warmth flow through his fingertips. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of human ambition, and he knew he had to be ready for whatever came next. Because surviving winter was one thing. Surviving people, that would be the real test. Winter deepened, and with it the tension around Caleb's tent grew heavier than the snow on the plains. The novelty of the haven had worn off for some, but envy and suspicion only grew. Every creak of the canvas, every curl of smoke from the stove's chimney seemed to draw eyes, watching, judging, waiting. Caleb had faced storms before, but this was different. This storm was human. It began subtly. Tools left outside went missing. A pile of firewood that had been meticulously stacked vanished overnight. Small, almost imperceptible scratches appeared along the tent's steel frame. Caleb noticed, of course. Nothing escaped his attention. He'd spent months reading the land like a book, and human mischief had a rhythm all its own. He didn't confront anyone immediately. He wanted to see who would push it further. And push it they did. One night, as the wind howled louder than ever and snow blinded the plains, Caleb heard a strange noise, a scraping, metallic and deliberate. He grabbed his lantern and stepped outside, snow crunching beneath his boots, heart steady despite the adrenaline. Shadows flitted between trees, too fast to catch, too calculated to be animals. "Show yourself," Caleb called, his voice cutting through the storm. A figure emerged from the darkness, Doyle Matthews. His face was flushed, eyes wild with anger and determination. In his hands he carried an axe, its blade glinting faintly in the lantern light. "You think you're better than us, Turner?" he shouted. "A tent keeps you warm while the rest of us freeze. I'm done watching you show us up." Caleb's grip on the lantern tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "This isn't about being better, Doyle. It's about surviving and learning. You're letting pride blind you." Doyle laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that mingled with the wind. "Pride? No, this is about justice. You've embarrassed us all. Tonight, your tent won't survive the winter. You'll see what it means to challenge tradition." Before Caleb could react, Doyle swung the axe toward the tent's main support pole. Caleb lunged, grabbing the handle just in time, metal scraping against metal with a screech that made the snow fall like rain. The world narrowed to a single, terrifying moment. The pole, the blade, the wind, and his own pulse hammering in his ears. "Back off," Caleb shouted, twisting Doyle away. They struggled in the snow, the storm whipping around them like a living creature, until Caleb's endurance and years of survival training gave him the upper hand. With a final shove, Doyle tumbled back, disappearing into the shadows. Caleb exhaled, chest heaving, eyes scanning the snow for any sign of the man returning. He was shaken, not by fear, but by the realization that envy could be more dangerous than the wildest blizzard. His tent, his sanctuary, had survived nature's worst. Could it survive human malice? The next morning, snow covered the plains like a pristine sheet, hiding the tracks of the night's struggle. Caleb inspected the tent carefully. The pole was bent, the canvas nicked, but it held. "Not bad," he muttered under his breath, a hint of grim pride in his tone. He reinforced the frame, adding extra support where Doyle's axe had struck. Every repair was meticulous, every adjustment a lesson learned. Word of the attack spread quickly. Some of the prospectors were horrified, others whispered with grim fascination. Even Harris, who had been Caleb's staunchest supporter, shook his head. People, they'll do anything when they're scared or jealous, he said softly, watching Caleb hammer reinforcements into place. You've built something incredible, but it paints a target on your back. Caleb nodded silently. He had expected envy, maybe even ridicule, but not outright aggression. It was a sobering reminder that human nature could be as unpredictable and ruthless as the wilderness itself. Winter pressed on, relentless. The storms became more frequent, the nights colder. Caleb pushed the stove to its limits, tested new insulation layers, and monitored the structural integrity of the tent like a scientist. Since tracking an experiment, he also began patrolling the surrounding area, keeping an eye out for any signs of sabotage. Every snowdrift, every bent branch, every unusual track became a clue. He was ready for whatever came next. And then came the day that changed everything. Caleb woke to an eerie silence, the kind that makes a man's skin prickle. He stepped outside, lantern in hand, and saw it immediately: Doyle's cabin, completely destroyed, roof caved in, walls splintered, smoke curling faintly from the remains. And standing at the edge of the wreckage, arms crossed, was Doyle himself, face set in a grim, almost resigned expression. "You did this," Caleb said, voice calm but hard. Doyle shook his head. "No, nature did, the storm, your tent." He gestured vaguely toward the plains. "It proved what I was too stubborn to see. Survival isn't about walls and roofs, it's about thinking, adapting, creating. You were right." Caleb stared at him, unsure whether to feel relief or lingering anger. Doyle's admission didn't erase the attack, the risk, or the damage, but it did mark a turning point. The other prospectors began arriving, witnessing the aftermath. They looked at Caleb's tent with renewed respect and, in some cases, a quiet sense of shame. Harris stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Kid, you've done more than survive winter. You've changed how we see it, how we live in it. And that's something else entirely." The recognition was gratifying, but Caleb felt a twinge of unease. He had survived storms and human aggression, but now the attention was growing beyond the valley. Letters from journalists, requests from engineers, and curious locals arrived daily. The haven was no longer just a personal achievement, it was a phenomenon. Then came Leela Granger again, the journalist who had visited weeks earlier. She arrived with a small film crew, eager to document the tent's performance in the dead of winter. Caleb welcomed her, though he was wary of turning his sanctuary into a spectacle. "You've created more than a tent," Leela said as they walked through the snow, camera rolling, breath steaming in the frigid air. "You've created a model, a blueprint for survival, innovation, and resilience. People will want this, Turner. They'll follow you, copy you, try to improve on it. Your tent, it's the beginning of something bigger than you or me." Caleb nodded slowly, absorbing her words. It was true. His work had become bigger than the winter, bigger than the valley, bigger even than himself. And for the first time, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. The blizzards continued, each one testing the limits of the haven. Snow piled higher, winds howled harder, and temperatures dipped lower than anyone in the valley could remember. But the tent endured, a testament to Caleb's ingenuity, patience, and stubbornness. Each successful night brought relief, each storm weathered without failure brought triumph. And yet Caleb couldn't shake a lingering thought. Survival wasn't static. It was a constant challenge. The wilderness had beaten him before, and people had tried to harm him. There would always be storms, some natural, some human-made. To endure, he would have to keep adapting, keep innovating, keep pushing boundaries. One night, as the northern lights danced across the sky in waves of green and violet, Caleb sat inside the haven, writing notes by the stove's warm glow. He paused, looking at the wind-ravaged world outside, feeling the weight of every choice, every risk, every moment that had led him here. He realized that survival wasn't just about enduring winter. It was about mastery, foresight, and courage. And Caleb Turner had proven, in the harshest way imaginable, that he possessed all three. But just as he leaned back to let the warmth of the fire seep into his bones, a shadow fell across the tent flap, and a voice called from the snow. "Turner, you need to see this." Caleb's heart raced. Outside in the storm's aftermath, something was happening, something that would push him, his tent, and his ideas to their absolute limits. The true test of the haven and of Caleb Turner was only just beginning. Caleb stepped out into the early morning light, the snow still heavy beneath his boots, and followed the voice. Harris was waiting near the edge of the valley, pointing toward a sight that made Caleb's stomach tighten. The plains were dotted with tents, small structures, and makeshift shelters, some clearly improvised, others carefully constructed. Men and women, prospectors and travelers alike, had come to see the haven and try to replicate it. How many? Caleb muttered, awe and anxiety mingling in his chest. Harris shook his head. I don't know, 50, maybe more. They've been arriving since before dawn. People heard about the tent and they came. Some for curiosity, some to survive, some to learn. Caleb's mind raced, his sanctuary his private. Each triumph had become a movement. The snow-crusted plains were no longer his alone. But as he watched the first rays of sunlight glint off steel poles and canvas flaps, he realized something profound. This was exactly what he wanted. Survival wasn't meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared, improved, and passed on. But sharing brought risks. With so many tents, so many inexperienced builders, the danger of accidents or failures loomed. Caleb knew some of these structures wouldn't withstand Montana's brutal winter. He saw a young man shivering beside a collapsing frame and immediately ran over, helping him reinforce it with spare poles and extra layers of canvas. Every lesson Caleb had learned through trial, fire, and storm was now being imparted to others. And with each intervention, he felt a growing sense of responsibility, not just for his own survival, but for the survival of all these people who had come to trust in him, in the haven. By midday, the valley had transformed into a bustling hub of activity. Fires burned safely inside reinforced tents, smoke rising like ribbons into the pale sky. People shared knowledge, stories, and laughter, forming bonds that only hardship and survival could create. Caleb moved among them, giving advice, adjusting frames, teaching techniques, and marveling at how quickly human ingenuity spread when guided by experience. Then came the unexpected. A journalist, one not from Helena but from a national outlet, arrived with a camera crew and a microphone. Leela Granger, with her crew, was already documenting the scene, and now another team wanted to capture Caleb and his tent on a larger stage. You're going national, Leela said, grinning as she adjusted her camera. The story's bigger than survival. It's about innovation, courage, and inspiring people to rethink what's possible. This is history in the making, Caleb. Caleb shrugged, feeling a mixture of pride and discomfort. Fame had never been the goal. His focus had always been on survival, on perfecting the art of living in winter. And yet, he realized that the story could inspire countless others to innovate, to adapt, to survive, and maybe even to thrive in conditions most would consider impossible. As he stepped back toward the haven, he noticed Doyle Matthews approaching. The man's face was calmer now, his pride humbled by winter, by Caleb's endurance, and by his own near failure. Kid, Doyle said, nodding, I owe you an apology and my thanks. That tent, your idea, it saved more than just me. It saved pride and maybe even lives. I was wrong. Caleb looked at him, eyes steady. We all make mistakes. Winter teaches humility faster than any man can. What matters is what you do after. Doyle extended his hand, and for the first time that winter, Caleb saw respect in the eyes of the man who had once tried to destroy his tent. They shook firmly, the gesture sealing an unspoken truce, a recognition of skill and courage. As night fell, Caleb stood outside the haven, watching the valley glow with the warmth of dozens of tents, each one standing tall against the snow and wind. He realized that survival was no longer a solitary pursuit. It was a collective effort, a community bound by resilience, determination, and the courage to think differently. And yet, for all its warmth and safety, Caleb felt a twinge of melancholy. The winter had revealed the limits of human jealousy, the dangers of envy, and the fragility of even the strongest structures when challenged. He knew that once the snow melted, people would leave, take what they learned, and return to their lives. But the lessons would remain, and perhaps, in time, his tent would inspire a new approach to shelter, ingenuity, and survival. He stepped inside, stoking the fire and letting the warmth wash over him. Every detail of the tent, the reinforced steel, the insulated canvas, the strategic airflow, was a testament to his dedication and stubbornness. This was more than survival, it was mastery. It was proof that one man's vision, patience, and refusal to follow tradition could reshape how people thought about life in the harshest conditions. Suddenly, a loud cheer rose from the valley. Caleb looked out to see a young boy standing atop a makeshift hill of snow, waving a flag he'd fashioned from canvas scraps. Around him, others clapped, laughed, and shouted, their voices carrying across the valley like a chorus of triumph. Caleb smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was pride, yes, but also hope. He realized that in sharing his knowledge, he had created something enduring, not just a tent, but a symbol, a beacon of human ingenuity, courage, and community. Later that night, as the northern lights painted the sky in swirling greens and purples, Caleb sat quietly by the stove. Leela approached, notebook in hand, her face illuminated by the firelight. "You did it, Caleb," she said softly. "Not just survived, not just built a tent, B. Ut changed how people see winter, survival, and themselves. This story, it's bigger than any of us imagined." Caleb nodded, letting the words sink in. He had begun the winter as a solitary man, skeptical neighbors at his heels, storms raging outside, and even human threats testing his resolve. He would leave it as a quiet legend, his tent standing as proof that ingenuity and courage could bend the world to one's will without breaking it. The tent had survived wind, snow, and human malice, and Caleb Turner had survived winter, doubt, and envy. But more than that, he had endured something far greater, the challenge of vision. The challenge of leading others not by force, but by example. He leaned back, watching the flames dance in the stove, and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The winter outside was still fierce, still demanding, but inside the haven there was warmth, safety, and something even stronger. The quiet, unshakable knowledge that what he had built, what he had shared, would endure long after the snow melted. For Caleb Turner, the man who had once been laughed at for his joke of a tent, the winter was no longer an enemy. It was a proving ground, a teacher, and ultimately a stage. And he had not only survived it, he had transformed it, and in doing so, transformed himself. As he lay down that night, listening to the storm outside and the muffled sounds of tents standing tall, Caleb realized one thing: survival was never just about enduring. It was about creating, innovating, and inspiring others to do the same. And in that realization, he found a warmth far greater than any stove could provide, a warmth that would carry him and those who followed through any winter to come. The wind howled, but Caleb Turner smiled. The tent stood strong. The valley was alive, and a quiet triumph settled over the plains, brighter than the northern lights themselves.